I see people up here. Welcome, everyone, book clubbers. I'm Megan, your host of the book club, and I'm here with my special guest, Steve Silberman.
Hi, nice to see everyone.
We are so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so Steve is the author of NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. He is the author of this fantastic book. And if you have not read it, you should definitely read it. Go get it. It is basically a book. It's the history of autism in our society. It talks about the major players in the world of autism, the researchers, the influencers, the treatment of autistics across the decades. And it talks about World War II, the eugenics. It talks about everything. If you want to know why we are where we are with autism, this will tell you. This is like the encyclopedia of autism history. So welcome and thank you. Oh, we have people commenting, and I will show them as we go. If you don't mind, I'll get into the first question.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. All right, so one question from our group was, how did you get started writing NeuroTribes? What was your process? How did you organize the sheer volume of information? And what kept you motivated to keep going on the book? So everything about your process.
Sure. Well, I tell a version of the story in the introduction to the book, but for people who haven't read it yet, this is the story. Way back in the year 2000, I was on a boat in Alaska with more than 100 computer programmers. And the occasion was this thing called a geek cruise. So this guy was basically organizing tech conferences on cruise ships, which seemed like a more interesting idea than like the Holiday Inn in Pittsburgh or something. You know?
Absolutely.
So the star of the cruise that I was on, which was up the panhandle of Alaska, and it was gorgeous, was this guy, Larry Wall, who invented one of the most useful and once popular, although it's now not quite as popular as it was, software programming languages in the world called Perl. And Perl is a very unusual language in that, for one thing, Larry is an unusual guy. He had sprinkled this throughout the source code of Perl, like quotes from his favorite book, which was The Lord of the Rings, you know? And Larry was just a hilariously wonderful and brilliant, eccentric guy. And towards the end of the cruise, I asked Larry if I could interview him at his home in Silicon Valley. And he said, yeah, sure. I should probably tell you, we have an autistic daughter. And this was back in 2000. And what almost everybody already forgets is that back in 2000, autism was considered very, very rare. The notion of autistic adults was still relatively new. The estimated prevalence was something like 1 in 10,000. So when he told me that, it didn't really make a big impact on me. I interviewed him, and that was it. And I wrote an article about the cruise. And then about 6 months later, I was writing an article about another technologically very adept family in Silicon Valley. The patriarch of the family actually had built the very first computer in the Middle East way back in the 1940s. And I asked the sister-in-law of this woman that I was profiling if I could interview her at home. And she said, yeah, sure. By the way, we have an autistic daughter. And I thought, oh, what a coincidence. I thought autism was rare. And so I was telling that exact story to a friend of mine in my favorite cafe here in San Francisco where I live. And a woman at the next table said, oh my God, do you realize what's going on? And I said, what's going on? And she said, there's an epidemic of autism in Silicon Valley. Something terrible is happening to our children.
I remember this story from the book.
Right. So I got the chills, and I was a science writer for Wired. So I thought, well, is this really true, And so I wrote an article called The Geek Syndrome, which, people were telling me, oh, it's the the silicon from the chips and the water, it's vaccines, So I looked into it, and what it looked like to me was that the genetics of autism could also convey certain kinds of advantages in a high-tech situation. And I heard from a lot of people who lived in other high-tech areas besides Silicon Valley that there seemed to be a lot of autism in those communities. And it seemed to me to be primarily genetic. And so what happened was I wrote that article and submitted it, and then 9/11 happened. It was originally supposed to be the cover article of Wired, but then for very understandable reasons, 9/11 happened. My article was thrown to the back of the magazine, and I thought no one would ever see it, really. I'd never hear anything again. But the opposite happened, which was that for 10 years, I got email about that article almost every week. And these emails were very much about basic human needs that were not being met by society. So I would get emails from parents. We've been waiting for 2 years for my child to be evaluated for autism. Or I'd get emails from autistic adults. I was told I was a genius when I was young, but I've never had a job because I can't make it through a face-to-face interview. I got email from autistic people saying, I can't get health care. This was before Obamacare. And so it seemed to me that the people on the front lines of autism, autistic people themselves and the families of autistic people, were really not being served well by society. Meanwhile, in that 10-year period, something else happened at the same time. Society was becoming completely obsessed with autism. Suddenly you heard it everywhere. It was like, autistic characters started appearing on television. But if you had an article about autism in the mainstream press, the comments section online would inevitably be dominated by anti-vaccine activists who would accuse you of being, quote unquote, a shill for big pharma if you did not believe that vaccines caused autism. And I was not a shill for big pharma. In fact, I had been very critical of big pharma, which occasionally does really terrible things in some articles that I'd written for Wired. So I was not a shill for big pharma. But after a while, I started to think, why are the concerns of the people on the front lines of autism so different from the concerns of the media, which was all about, do vaccines cause autism? And I got this intuition that something had gone wrong in the telling of autism history over the years. And so I thought, well, I'll just start digging really deeply into the history of autism. And I found that, in fact, a lot had gone wrong, and that there were a lot of misunderstandings about autism throughout history and autistic people throughout history. And it was originally supposed to take me a year and a half to write a 250-page book. I ended up taking 5 years at least of 80 hours a week work every week. I didn't have 2 consecutive days off in 5 years. It literally almost killed me. It was actually kind of bad for my health, really. But
you didn't know how far down that rabbit hole went.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the rabbit hole went really deep, and into the Holocaust and into even before the official discovery of autism. And once I sort of began to get a grasp on how messed up the normal social view of autism compared to what the actual history was, I became obsessed with telling the story in a way that would not just appeal to people who were autistic themselves or directly involved with autism, but would educate general readers too about what had really happened and the perilous situation that autistic people and their families were in right now that had nothing to do with the question of vaccines or what causes autism. And, my imperative was to make it such a compelling story, like kind of a page turner. Like I didn't want to, I appreciate that you said that NeuroTribes is an encyclopedia of autism, but I didn't want it to read like an
Oh,
encyclopedia.
it didn't.
Yeah, I
Definitely
wanted it
didn't.
to read like a mystery story or even a thriller, you know. And so because I had a lot of experience in journalism before that, I knew how to write an exciting story without exaggerating or anything like that. Just tell the story, just the facts.
The story is interesting enough in itself, and you wrote it so well.
Thank you. So that's how I got started in autism and writing NeuroTribes.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot of work. I mean, I can just imagine the effort it took to peel back all of those layers.
Oh yeah. For a while I was staying up until 2 a.m. and getting up at 5. It was crazy.
Not eating.
Right. Well, no, I always ate, unfortunately. But yeah, no, it was.
Okay, so another question from the club. And I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday. So can we talk about the intersection of neurodiversity and racial diversity? And in your book, there wasn't a whole lot on that subject. And let me see what the question said. I wrote my notes down. I always write notes. Could you talk about why that wasn't discussed a lot and maybe some projects that you've been working on in this area?
Sure. What it is that people of color in the periods of history that I was mostly writing about hardly ever got an autism diagnosis. If your child was autistic, for one thing, I remember I spoke to a clinician who started diagnosing autism based on Leo Connor's work back in the 1940s. So we're talking about old school. Mm-hmm. She told me that most parents who would come to see her to get a diagnosis of autism for their child had already been through 10 therapists by the time they saw her. Can you imagine how limited the access was to an autism diagnosis if you had to be able to afford to have seen 10 therapists by the time you got to her? So there was definitely class and racial discrimination. Also, there are many papers out on the fact that basically if you were an upper middle class white kid back in the not just the 40s, but the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you would get a diagnosis of autism if you could afford it for your child. Whereas if you were Black or poor, your child would get a diagnosis of intellectual disability, or as they called it very ableistly then, mental retardation. There's been a lot of what's called diagnostic substitution of kids who were given a diagnosis of intellectual disability, who we now know were almost certainly autistic, and many of them were people of color. So a lot of the periods that I wrote about, there were hardly any people of color who were diagnosed, not none, but hardly any. And in fact, this was such a problem that a very well-known sociologist named Victor Sanua suggested, I believe in the 80s, I think, or maybe the 70s, that people of color were immune to autism. Like, that's how bad the access to diagnostic resources were for people of color. So one might ask, why aren't there more people of color in the very last parts of my book, which cover an era when they could have gotten a diagnosis? That's a very good question, and I feel bad about that. And what happened was, as I mentioned, my book was originally supposed to be 250 pages. That's what the contract was. I handed it in at 800.
Look at this book here.
Yeah, I handed it in at 8. My editor was like, I thought my editor would think I was nuts, and just drop the contract after 5 years, And what she said was, it's an excellent book, but at 800 pages, no one's going to read it. We have to cut, a bunch of chapters. And we had like a week and a half to do that before it went to the press. So I just said to my editor, who was excellent, Megan, you just suggest what I should cut. She ended up cutting, I believe, 3 chapters from the end. And unfortunately, one of those chapters focused on autistic people of color. And I feel really bad about that. What I did to try to slightly make up for it, although I understand that I didn't totally make up for it, is I wrote an article for a science magazine online called Undark, and my title, the title of my piece is The Invisibility of Black Autism. And so I actually used some of the parts of the book that did not come out in the book in that article. So if anyone wants to know what I think about that, read The Invisibility of Black Autism in Undark.
I'm writing that down, and we'll put a link up to, is that online or?
Yeah, it's online.
Okay, we'll put a link up for the book clubbers to follow that.
Yep.
I think, yeah, it is unfortunate that that was one of the chapters left out, because I think that that's, you know, there is a lot of people of color that are also disabled. They have it's like a multiplier effect of challenges that they face.
It's unbelievable. I mean, you know, and now, well, I don't want to get into the current state of politics, but let's put it this way. Some of the decisions that are being made in Washington are going to make life much worse, both for disabled people and people of color and disabled people of color. So that's a big issue. One of our viewers here said, "Can we get access to the cut chapters?" I'm sorry, I can't do it, but I did publish some of that chapter in that article, The Invisibility of Black Autism, which someone just posted the link to very helpfully.
I have a feeling one of my moderators is on right now, helping me out. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see. Okay. All right. I'm gonna get a little controversial.
You've already gotten a little controversial. We've already talked about Asperger and race. Those are two of the most controversial.
Just a little bit more. We're going to inch it over just a little bit more, because I do want to hear your thoughts on this. And it doesn't have anything to do with your book. I mean, you kind of touched a little bit on it, but I want to know what your thoughts are about Autism Speaks as an advocacy organization. And I'll have a follow-up question as to who do you support? What advocacy organizations do you support? We have a lot of new parents in the group. We have a lot of teachers in the group. And every April comes around and everybody's doing, the money starts flowing in April, right? For Autism Awareness Month, World Autism Day. And Autism Speaks is on, I mean, they've got a lot of ads out. So, you know, people donate to them, and I want to hear your thoughts on that organization.
Okay, I am not a supporter of Autism Speaks. I have never done an event for them. When I was invited to the Smithsonian to talk about problems of representation of autistic people in media, I was actually invited by a science officer of Autism Speaks, and I did it because what I planned to do and did was to spend the entire time talking about the horrible portrayals of autism that Autism Speaks has put into the media. I mean, that, you know, a lot of people know about their video, I Am Autism, which basically presented autism as like somewhere between a pedophile and a disease, stalking kids in school. I mean, they put out horrible messaging. Another horrible message that they put out, even against the desires of some of their own scientists, I later discovered, was Jerry Dawson, the former chief science officer of Autism Speaks, went on every network news station saying that autism was an epidemic. That sounds like something you can catch in the schoolyard to me. And when I asked her, you know, why she used the word epidemic when her own scientists were not using that word, she said, well, that was, you know, basically just to catch the attention of people in Congress. Nobody listens if you say, well, maybe there's been a true rise in prevalence or not, you know. So I have other problems with Autism Speaks. Some of them are, well, I'll give you an example. I went to visit Autism Speaks headquarters at one point, and this was not related to the interview I was doing there, but I saw a group of young autistic adults being sort of led around the headquarters in the most condescending way. it was they were not being treated well. And I was truly horrified, to be honest with you.
As if they were put on display, or
the person was just had no, like they were, you know, it was like it was as if the person thought they were herding cattle or something. You know, I mean, it was grotesque, actually. Also, the executives at Autism Speaks famously, you know, took very high salaries. And one of the things that I'm proud of, actually, is that my book became a New York Times bestseller with not only no help from Autism Speaks, no help, but the only time they ever mentioned my book, which was a frickin' New York Times bestseller, on their blog, was a very critical and personal comment made about me by their former president, Liz Feld. And, you know, what can I say? The one thing I do want to say is that I'm not in favor of the puzzle piece. You know, I think even with the rainbow that they've now, you know, put on it, you know, they've sort of realized like, oh, we can't stop just dismissing this neurodiversity thing, so we'll make our puzzle piece a rainbow.
Well, now they're appropriating the rainbow for their, I mean, geez, leave it
well,
alone.
I don't, you know, I mean,
stay over there.
You know, the rainbow is, you know, it's okay, but still, they definitely are trying to appropriate some kind of neurodiversity vibe. One thing that, sorry, I'm getting distracted by
That's okay.
One thing that is true is that there was the reason the puzzle piece came to be identified with autism was not Autism Speaks. The puzzle piece was in use starting from the very first Parents Association in the world, which became the inspiration for Bernie Rimland to start what became the National Autistic Society here. Back then in London, it was called the National Association for Autistic Children or something like that. It's in my book. Anyway, a father, developed a puzzle piece because he was so blown away by the fact that his autistic kid could put together jigsaw puzzles upside down without looking at the image. So it didn't start out as an insult, but certainly by now, with the appropriation of that symbol by Autism Speaks has been so insulting and unapologetic and dismissive of autistic voices. That's what they're doing. Yeah. They marginalize the voices of autistic adults, the people most affected by the images that they spread. So no, I do not support Autism Speaks personally. Although, you know, I mean, I will say there are a couple of good people, and you know, who I met in the organization, but you know,
as a whole, their message is damaging.
Their whole message, I'm not.
As a whole, yeah.
And what I would suggest is that, you know, obviously, like sometimes I see like parents get attacked because they're kind of naive about the history and they want to do something for autism. And what I do suggest is that there's an organization called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, or Aut Self-Advocacy on Twitter. They do really great work. They do work in public policy because the guy who founded the organization, as I talk about in my book, Ari Ne'eman, founded that group when he was a teenager. And his special interest, as people say, was public policy. He's incredibly effective policy maker and critiquer. And
your friend Dr. Prezant would call that his enthusiasm.
Yes, exactly. And that's a very good word. And by the way, I love Barry Prezant. And his book, Uniquely Human, came out the same month, I think, that NeuroTribes did. We instantly discovered that they were like sister books in a way. I think of my book as the history and his book as the history applied, really.
He came for a meeting, I think in December, and we talked about that because I asked him a question about your book, and he told us that they came out within maybe weeks of each other. So that
they did. And plus he's such a great guy, and something I would very much recommend for parents who are feeling burned out. Yes, wonderful book. I completely endorse it. And for parents He does an annual retreat that I believe you can get full scholarship for. And, a lot of parents say, oh, I could never have, 2 days free, to do this. Every parent I've ever spoken to who attended Barry Present's annual retreat felt really encouraged by it and felt really supported by the community of other parents.
He talked about that retreat in his book.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, Barry's a wonderful guy.
We have so many comments. I think that we've lit some fire.
Yeah. And there are other, by the way, I don't want to say that, ASAN is the only group I support. They're not. There's a group in the UK called Autistic UK on Twitter that is wonderful. I did a presentation, not a presentation. I took part in a sort of a panel. Well, I attended an event and spoke. Run in Manchester by Autistic UK. They were wonderful. An interesting thing, oftentimes there's sort of this controversy between it's like framed as autistic adults versus parents. Mm-hmm. Almost everybody in that room was a parent themselves, and they were all autistic. And it was a thrilling event. So for if anybody hears this in Europe, Autistic UK is a great organization. I just got contacted yesterday. I haven't even had the chance to look at it yet, but another group of autistic adults that is, instead of depending on a neurotypical run organization to look out for their interests, they're doing it themselves. And I'm very much in favor of either autistic run organizations or organizations that include autistic adults at the top level in decision-making roles and in public spokespeople roles.
And not just one token, not just one.
Yeah, not just one token. I mean, John Elder Robeson, who's a very good friend of mine, he's the author of the bestseller "Look Me in the Eye." He was the. I don't want to insult him and say he was the token at Autism Speaks for a while,
right?
But he kind of was, he was so mistreated that he eventually quit. So we need full autistic representation in groups that are about autism. And that's something that I put into practice myself. And I'll give you a very crisp example. The Autism Society of America asked me a couple of years ago to give a closing keynote for their annual conference. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, enough of me talking, enough of an NT like taking up the spotlight. So I said, what I'd rather do is just moderate a panel of autistic adults, including, by the way, an autistic adult who used typing to speak. So it was not like all, shiny autistics, as people say. And I asked them to develop their own topics for discussion. So it wasn't even me like saying, I want to hear about what you guys think about blah, blah, blah. It was what they wanted to talk about. And I asked the Autism Society of America if we could do that instead of me giving another presentation. They went for it. It was a marvelous event. So what I've done is to try to, I'm going to drink some water here. It has oranges in it. It's not a cocktail.
Darn, it should be.
Well, I'm the son of an alcoholic, so I can't really do it. But in any case, it turned out to be a really illuminating event for everyone.
I bet.
For the parents, for the clinicians, and for the autistic adults. So when I can, I'm not always given the choice, but when I can, I try to share the attention that I get. And whenever, and I've been doing this even from before the book came out, whenever a journalist asks me, Steve, what do you think about blah, blah, blah about autism? I say, have you talked to autistic adults? And I give them, I make it easy. I give them emails, I give them phone numbers, and then autistic voices come to the fore in the social conversation about autism, which is how it should be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There are so many our group is silly. We wouldn't judge if it was a cocktail.
Oh. I would judge myself. Anyway.
Pass the mic. Thank you for amplifying our voice instead of talking over us. or for us.
Indeed. And, something I try to do on Twitter, because I have a lot of Twitter followers. Something I try to do is just retweet Autistic Voices. Like anybody who looks through my years of tweeting, I definitely try to bring Autistic Voices into the foreground. And there's a wonderful, one of my autistic friends who I think is amazingly talented and charming, is a 15-year-old naturalist in England named Dara McAnulty, who's coming out with, believe it or not, his first book next year. And so I've offered to have a conversation with him at the Hay Festival, which is probably the best literary festival in the world, really. It's in this charming town in Wales with like 40 bookstores in this tiny town. And so I'm going to be introducing Dara and raising his profile as much as I can, although he barely needs the help.
What is his book's name?
I'm forgetting right now.
That's okay.
But if you, I'm sorry, I'm old. But if you Google Dara McAnulty, DARAMCANULTY, or on Twitter, Naturalist Dara, I'm sure it'll be the first result.
Awesome. I have to write everything down or I'll forget.
No problem.
Oh, somebody said add it to the list. Yeah, we have a list in the club that's like, it's so jumbled. It has, I don't know how many books it has up there, but
the thing about Dara is he's not just like, I don't say like, oh, he's a talented autistic author.
Right.
He's a talented author.
Right.
He's 15. Oh my God.
Right.
It's amazing.
Right. I mean, that's just like,
yes, Diary of a Young Naturalist. Yeah. Thank you for whoever retrieved that. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I can't see who it is. I'm sure that it's one of my moderators.
Yeah, that's great.
They're so awesome. Let's see. Maybe we should, do you want to do one more question, or?
Yeah, sure.
Is your voice about to go out? We'll do one more. I'll do a closing question for you. I'm going to take off another controversial question because.
Well, also ask me about what I'm working on now, because it's not autism. It's
what was that?
Right.
What did you say?
I would appreciate if you would also ask me what I'm working on now, which is not autism.
I would love to hear about what are you working on now?
My next book is going to be a history of cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis. I have heard of that. It's a genetic condition that decades ago was considered invariably fatal. If your child was born with cystic fibrosis, you were told, take her home for a couple of months and enjoy her. That's all the time you will have with her. Now, people with cystic fibrosis are able to live into middle age and beyond. And in fact, in the most recent times, a new drug called Trikafta has been introduced by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that is as close to a miracle drug as I've ever seen. I'm writing the book for one of my best friends, a guy named Phil, who has cystic fibrosis. He was diagnosed with end-stage cystic fibrosis. This drug came out. He's doing much better. And everybody in that community are hearing about other people who are doing much better since taking that drug. It's an amazing story with a very deep history, just like autism. And my book is going to be called The Taste of Salt. I can't estimate when it's going to be done because I'm pretty much, still in the beginning stages of research. And we know how my research process tends to go overboard.
Yeah.
But I've already spoken to a lot of people, and I'm very excited about it. And it's a really different, there are a set of different questions around it. For instance, the formation of the autistic community for autistic adults is such a landmark moment in NeuroTribes. Like the autistic adults and autistic organizations like ASAN are basically the cavalry who rides in at the end of NeuroTribes to get things in a better place. People with cystic fibrosis, as anyone who's seen the movie called 5 Feet Apart has seen, they're discouraged from socializing with one another because they can swap bacterial infections that can be fatal. So all of that community happens online for the most part. Another thing is that, one of the biggest, most controversial questions in autism is, should anyone be researching a cure? Autistic people say no. I completely understand that. I would not want a cure for my own homosexuality, which scientists would have been working on if the psychiatric establishment had not been so busy putting people like me in mental institutions when I was in high school for being gay. Now I'm happily married. Hello. And my husband is Ward Q Normal on Twitter. Anyway, in cystic fibrosis, yes, you want a cure. Nobody thinks that it makes them who they are. It's freaking fatal. You have to spend hours a day doing physical therapy. And one of the reasons why I took on this project is that, without getting into it, there's a lot of noise in the culture lately. Like, people are fighting with each other. Everyone's angry. There's a lot of sort of political infighting, and all that. These people are dealing with issues of life and death every day of their lives. And I just wanted to write about people who are talking about real stuff. And so that's why I'm writing my book, The Taste of Salt, about cystic fibrosis. It should be out in a couple of years.
Well, I'm interested to hear about that. It sounds like great work that you're doing. I mean, the work that you've already done for the autistic community is amazing, and I can just imagine the impact it will have on the cystic fibrosis community.
I'm looking at that. Let me just go back and look at what this question is.
Yeah, I was trying to find it when we were talking.
I know that in South Asia. Oh, yes, that's a very important issue. The treatment of autistic people in third world countries is terrible. It's horrible. I've heard about, kids in India being chained like animals in their backyards. And it's not, by the way, just third world countries. One bit of news that, is just going to be coming out soon is that my book was just published in French. It's already, or is going to be published in French.
It hasn't been published in French yet?
Yes, one might ask, why hasn't it been published in French when it's been published in 16 other languages? That's because in France, they still think that parents cause autism. And they still hold on to the bogus, wrong, damaging BS of Bruno Bettelheim, who, declared that autism moms were like concentration camp commandants. That's a direct quote. But certainly in third world countries, there is a lack of information about autism. And not totally. I know some people are doing very good work in India, for instance. And they're working with a German software company called SAP to increase employment among autistic adults. That's all excellent. I was very happy to see that there was a conference about neurodiversity in Ghana.
I saw that
a couple of years ago. Yeah. So the concept of neurodiversity is spreading throughout the world. But obviously in countries where access to healthcare for poor people is very limited already, all the problems that face families of autistic people and autistic people themselves in first world countries are 1,000 times worse. So that, yes, that's a huge issue.
We're going to have to fight for change. I know I do have a big following from India. And then I have a lot of people that follow my page on Facebook from Africa, from South Africa.
Yeah.
So I wish for them that they can speed up their access to healthcare and their knowledge about neurodiversity. That's what I wish for them.
Yeah. I'm happy to take one more question, even if it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. If you could give one piece of advice or one piece of knowledge to new parents or teachers of autistic kids, what would you tell them?
One thing I would tell them is that I would tell them a couple of different things. One thing is that the way that your kid or the child in your class is when they're 5 is not necessarily going to be the way that they're going to be when they're 40. You know, every neurotypical kid, that is the understanding. Oh, maybe they'll develop, you know. And speaking to people like Temple Grandin and John Elder Robeson and many, many autistic adults, they developed a lot of social skills on their own non-neurotypical schedule, you know. The milestones for autistic people are different than the milestones for neurotypical people.
Throw it out the window.
Yeah, exactly. Throw out the neurotypical map. The other thing I would say, and this is really important, is that one of the most important things I think you can do as a parent or a teacher or a clinician is to read the words of autistic people themselves. And there are excellent books out there. For instance, since we were talking about racial issues earlier, there's a book, there's an anthology called All the Weight of Our Dreams, which is a book about
on our list.
Right, exactly. And there are many, many books now. I mean, it's practically a burgeoning industry of books by autistic people. Read those books. Furthermore, make sure that if we're talking about a young person, that they have access to autistic adults. Just let them hang out with autistic adults. And people say, well, you know, my child is not like Temple Grandin. Temple Grandin was not like Temple Grandin when she was 10. You know, I have seen the boy in my book, Leo Rosa, the boy who loves green straws, who is, you know, not very verbal, hang out with one of my favorite autistic people, this guy named Stephen Shore. He's awesome. They had a connection together, you know, that I would never have been able to have with either one of them. And I've seen that over and over again. Young autistic people need autistic adults around for peer mentoring, because how else is an autistic kid going to have any hope for his or her own future unless they meet autistic adults who have good lives and who have figured out how to get through this horrible society that we've built for them, you know? So I think
there was a mentorship, like a big brother, big sister program for that, nationwide or worldwide for our smaller kids to have access to those adults. That would be amazing.
And also, you know, one of the most hopeful developments that I've seen in the last few years is neurodiversity groups on campuses and in workplaces, so that even people who are not yet comfortable with disclosing can at least disclose to their non-neurotypical peers and get support. And I think that's a very encouraging thing. If you have if you're teaching a psychology class, instead of, you know, reading psychology papers about autism in the class, bring in an autistic adult or 5 and have them talk about what it's really like to be autistic and the challenges that they face.
And because the problem is the misinformation is still being spread throughout the colleges, throughout for the grad schools, the doctoral programs. I mean, they still have seriously outdated information. I see grad students all the time doing projects, and it makes me cringe when I see some of the things that they're posting about.
Yeah, I have to say, it's kind of amazing to me. Like, you know, for instance, one of the things I write about in the book is that one of Asperger's Jewish college. Oh yes, ICANN Network. I love the ICANN Network in Australia. A fantastic group for peer mentoring of autistic people. I've done at least one event with them.
Here.
They're awesome. Well, they're in Australia, but you know, we have groups here too. So yes, I would say that the two things I would say to parents are you know, don't lose hope or develop a limited conception of what your child is capable of, and allow your children to have access to other autistic people in the autistic community. Those are the two very powerful bits of advice that I would give.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to wrap it up because we have been on for over an hour. And for those of you who who haven't read NeuroTribes yet, this book taught me so much. Sometimes I don't even like talking about autism related subjects with people that haven't read it yet, because I feel like I have so much more information. I just want to kind of just refer them to page 262 in your book. Like, have you read this yet? Well, remember what Steve said in his book.
Well, what's funny is sometimes people say to me, so what do you say in NeuroTribes, like on Twitter? Oh yeah, I'll do it at 140 characters right away.
Right.
550 pages,
The title alone is like 130.
Right, exactly. Right.
So okay, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And
I'm
also,
very honored to be asked. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Also, thank you for the donations of your signed copies of your books earlier in the book club days. This book was the reason we started the book club, because
awesome.
This was
that
the reason.
Awesome.
I saw it in the library, and I said, I can't do this myself. I need some help. And it ended up, we had like 600 members in the first like 3 weeks before we even started reading the book. So thank you for joining us in our discussions, and thank you for giving us signed copies of your book to give away. That was amazing. We had 3 people that won those books. So thank you for everything.
Excellent. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You'll have to come back to the comment section, because they're just coming in and coming in and coming in.
Okay. I may or may not. I'm kind
Whatever.
of busy.
It's fine.
I'll try. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk to you guys later, book clubbers.
All right. Take care. Bye.